Okay, so we're going to begin chapter 1 here in the Hofnagel's textbook on the scientific study of life. This is going to be kind of our intro chapter, setting a baseline for what we're going to see in the rest of the course as far as what makes something alive and a lot of the kind of characteristics we're going to see throughout most of this course. So, as I mentioned, right, so obviously this is a biology course. We're studying life. Biology is the study of life. One of the first things we have to do is figure out what makes something alive. In other words, what are the characteristics of life? So I've used this slide for like almost 10 years. I put this together and I always ask my classes, right, which one of these things would be a living thing and which one of these things are not living things. And of course, nobody really has much of a problem with any of them. You've got the gorilla, which was alive. You've got the beetle, which was alive. You got a sponge, which not maybe in this picture, but at one point in time, a sponge was a living organism. We've got a tree, we've got a plant, and this thing up here, which is probably the hardest one for most of us, is called a diatom, which is a type of algae up in the upper left-hand corner up here. Those are all living things, or would have been living things at the time the picture was taken. The broom, the crystal, the saline, the car, those would have all been non-living things, and people typically don't have too much of a problem with that. So what I always do here is, okay, well, you obviously know which things are alive. You know which things are non-living things. So how do you know? Like, what is your criteria for making something a living thing or a non-living thing? Right? And that's where we get into these next series of slides. So we want to look at, first off, some things that classes sometimes tell me that make something alive that maybe isn't necessarily truly a characteristic of a living thing. Movement, number one. Living things do not have to move. Okay, so you think about things like fungi, you think about things like plants, totally living things, but don't really move around a whole lot. If you see a tree get up and walk around, you probably should go ahead and get your meds checked because that ain't normal, right? In other words, clouds can also move, water can move, air can move, and of course those are all non-living things. So movement by itself doesn't necessarily qualify as a criteria to say that something is absolutely definitely alive. What about sensitivity? Right? Living things tend to respond to stimuli. That's going to be one of our characteristics of living things we're going to see here in a few minutes. Living things respond to stimuli, but what type of stimulus? Different types of organisms respond to different types of stimuli, so you've got to be careful here. If you walk up and kick that tree that you thought just got up and walked around because you're angry at it, it's probably not going to care a whole lot. On the other hand, your toe is going to have other thoughts on the matter. But trees and plants do respond to stimuli. They respond to sunlight. They respond to gravity. They respond to water and nutrients. They respond to all kinds of things. So you got to make sure that if you're talking about stimuli and sensitivity, that you're talking about the appropriate type of stimulus to which an organism can be sensitive. Another one that comes up a lot is that living things always die. And that is definitely truly the case. But on the other hand, just because something isn't alive doesn't necessarily mean it's dead, right? So I'm sitting here right now in my house and I'm looking at our couch. Our couch definitely is not a living thing. But on the other hand, would you really say that, oh, geez, my couch is dead? You know, somebody sent me a sympathy card because my couch is dead. It's not alive anymore. It's dead. So in the entire world, there's only two categories of things, living things and dead things. I really don't go with it. I don't really think of my couch as being a dead thing so much. All right, so yes, living things do die, but just because something is alive doesn't necessarily mean it's dead either necessarily. So that's kind of a weird circular argument. The last one is complexity. Kind of a subjective, relative sort of a thing. I mean, computers are pretty complex, but probably not alive depending on which movie you've seen. Cellularity is maybe a better way to go with that. Living things are made of cells, which makes them complex. That's maybe a little more specific way of looking at things. All right, so movement, sensitivity, death, complexity, those are all characteristics that do not necessarily define a living thing. But now we're going to look at the things that do define life. Living things always have some type of hereditary material. In other words, parents have a way to pass on information about themselves to their offspring. Every living thing does this. Living things have DNA. Living things often have RNA as well. We're going to talk more about those later on. They are the molecules of heredity. These are the bits of chemical that tells an offspring how to make itself. This is what the parents give to the offspring. And the gametes, the sperm cells, the egg cells. Those cells contain DNA, which can be passed on to the offspring to tell the offspring how they need to go ahead and make their bodies. Specifically, DNA is a recipe to make a protein. And I cannot overemphasize that. That is super, super important. DNA is a recipe to build a protein. Right? That's the genetic material. Right? So we look at things like DNA. DNA and RNA are made up of something called nucleotides. Nucleotides are like the alphabet of the DNA language. Nucleotides determine what the DNA says. There's 4 different nucleotides, A, C, G, and T. You've probably heard about that at some point in your past, maybe. Depending on the order of those A's and C's and G's and T's, that's what determines what a given gene or a piece of DNA is actually going to do. Now, the genes themselves, in the human genome, right, I talked about a gene, DNA is a recipe to make protein. A genome is like the whole recipe book, right? So you've got your recipe book comprised of recipes to make stuff. We've got a genome comprised of genes to make stuff. In this case, the stuff is proteins, right? So genes are recipes to make proteins, but sometimes you can have different versions of those recipes. Think about the dear old Aunt Judy, right? Aunt Judy's got a killer recipe for meatloaf. It's a recipe to make meatloaf, but on the other hand, even though Aunt Judy has her recipe for meatloaf, Mom has her own recipe for meatloaf. It's not as good, don't tell Mom that, but she has her own recipe to make meatloaf. Both of those 2 recipes give you meatloaf in the end. They both give you the same kind of end product. Are they identical? No. Aunt Judy's is better, of course. But they both give you meatloaf. So alleles are just different versions of the same gene. They're different ways to make kind of the same thing, right? So you've got one allele to make hemoglobin. That's the stuff in your blood that carries oxygen. Somebody else might have a slightly different version of hemoglobin, slightly different allele to make their own hemoglobin, right? So that's one of the ways we get to have a lot of diversity in what we see around us in the living world. We talked about the genome, right? The genome is the entire set of DNA, the entire recipe book of DNA that's used to comprise all those proteins that an organism finds in its body. Right? So it's really critical that when cells divide, and we're not going to talk much about cell division in this course, but when cells divide, they have to divide all the time. Right? Your cells are dividing right now, I promise. If they're not, you got a problem, right? Your cells divide. It's really important that they pass on accurate copies of their DNA to the next cells, the next generation of cells. You do not want to have mutations, for example. Mutations typically tend to be, if not neutral, then maybe harmful, deleterious, bad kinds of things. We want to make sure DNA is copied accurately and faithfully from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. All right, criteria number 2 for a living thing. Living things are always made out of cells. So we're going to talk about cellularity next. There's something called cell theory in biology. Cell theory's got 3 parts to it. So when you go back and you're quizzing yourself on this, you say self, as I often call myself. What are the 3 parts of cell theory? Well, number 1 is all living things are made of cells. We've never seen a living organism that was not made of cells. Living things are always, always, always made out of cells. There is no non-cellular living thing as far as we've ever been able to tell. So all living things are made out of cells. Number 2, cells are only created from pre-existing cells, which if you think about it, logically presents a bit of a question. Because if cells only come from pre-existing cells, then the question should be asked, where did that first cell come from? Or how did that first cell come to be? And we really don't have a good scientific explanation for how that was. We don't know how the first cell came to be, at least in a scientific sort of way of thinking. And then the third part of cell theory says that cells are the simplest unit of life. In other words, nothing smaller than a cell can be considered alive. We look at this fancy picture down here on the bottom right. We've got a cell with a bunch of stuff. We have a nucleus, we've got smooth ER, we've got ribosomes and cytoplasm and flagella, cilia kinds of things, and lysosomes and rough ER and mitochondria and plasma membranes and all kinds of fancy stuff inside that cell. But if you take any single piece out of this cell, take the Golgi out of the cell, take the smooth ER out of the cell, take the vesicles out of the cell, the nucleus out of the cell, this Golgi out of the cell, right? If you take those little bits and pieces out of a cell, isolate them somewhere in a lab on a culture plate and say, okay, live, doesn't work. You have to have the entire cell. The entire cell must be there in order for that entity to be considered a living thing. You got to have the whole package. Nothing smaller than a cell exhibits the properties of life. You got to have the whole thing. All right. So lots of complexity on the inside of this. This one happens to be a plant cell because it's got a cell wall. Right? Animal cells never have a cell wall. Plant cells do. Fungal cells typically do as well. Protist cells can have a cell wall. Prokaryotes, bacteria, things like that have a cell wall, but of course, they don't have a nucleus, or organelles really. So this would not be a bacterial cell. Most likely, this is a plant cell. All right, so some things that all cells have. Doesn't matter what kind of cell you are, doesn't matter what your persuasion is as a cell, things that all cells have. Number one, they have to have DNA. All right, we said that all living things have DNA. Cells are living, so we know cells have to have DNA. Right? It's not a great leap of faith there to make that conclusion. All cells have DNA. All cells have at least one type of organelle. This is a little tricky. All cells have ribosomes. Jump back a second here. Ribosomes. Ribosomes are these little tiny itty bitty dots that we see in this cell. There's a little dark dot there, and one here, and one here, and one here, and one over there. Free ribosomes. You've also got ribosomes on the thing called the rough ER over here. All cells have those little dots, those ribosomes. What do those ribosomes do? Those ribosomes make proteins. Right? They are the protein workbenches of the cell. Right? Those are where proteins get made. Now, beyond that, some cells have all kinds of other organelles. All the stuff we saw in that slide 2 slides ago, all the extra stuff, the bells and whistles. Some cells have that stuff too, but not all of them do. But at a minimum, all cells have to have ribosomes. So we know they have DNA. We know they have organelles. All cells also have something called a plasma membrane, which is the membrane on the outside of the cell. Now, don't fall into the trap here. I've seen a lot of people do this, a lot of different classes. A lot of people want to say that a plasma membrane and a cell wall are the same thing. A plasma membrane is not the same thing as a cell wall. A cell wall is a very, very, very different thing. It's not just a different name. It's a completely different structure. Plasma membrane is very dynamic. There's all kinds of stuff happening with the plasma membrane. Cell wall is important, but it's nowhere near as dynamic. So all cells have a plasma membrane. Not all cells have a cell wall, by the way, but all cells do have a plasma membrane. That's number 3. The fourth thing that all cells have is that all cells have cytoplasm. This one down here, cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the stuff inside the plasma membrane. It's made up of something called cytosol, which is kind of a fluid substance. It's made up of organelles. It's made up of the nucleus. It's all the stuff inside the plasma membrane. That's called the cytoplasm. So 4 things all cells have: genes / DNA, ribosomes, plasma membranes, and cytoplasm. All right, next up on our list, all living things carry out metabolism. Now I'm going to give you the Rosemeyer definition of what metabolism is. Okay, metabolism is where you take stuff. It's a pretty formal definition. It's where you take stuff from your environment and use that to make more of yourself. Now, what do I mean make more of yourself? Well, it could mean that you're repairing damage that was done to your body, which happens all the time, by the way. It's not just like a acute injury that happens. It's cells that are lost from the lining of your intestine. It's cells lost from the surface of your skin. Those cells have to be replaced. So sometimes carrying out metabolism means taking nutrients or energy from your environment and using that to replace the cells you've lost. You can't replace cells if you don't have raw materials to do it. Carrying out metabolism could also mean growth. You can't get bigger unless you have a source of raw materials. You can't build a house unless you have concrete and 2x4s, dimensional lumber, shingles, plumbing, stuff, all wires, all that kind of stuff. You have to have all of that if you're going to build a house. You have to have raw materials if you're going to build a cell. So carrying out metabolism not only means repairing yourself, but it also is required for growth and also for reproduction. Right? So for metabolism, this is the source of where we get our stuff to maintain ourselves. We're getting materials from the environment, using those to maintain ourselves, or replace cells in our bodies, or even reproduce. There's another term here called homeostasis. And homeostasis means maintaining a consistent internal environment. So body temperature, for example. Most of the time, your body temperature is around 98.5, depending on who you are. Some people a little warmer, some people a little cooler, but on average for the human is around 98.5. It's not by accident, right? If it's 30 degrees outside, your body temperature is going to be roughly 98.5. If it's 105 degrees outside, your body temperature is going to be roughly 98.5. Right? It doesn't change a whole lot. Your body has mechanisms to maintain conditions inside of itself for temperature, for pH, for pressure, for all different kinds of things. Calcium levels in your blood, glucose levels in your blood. Your body maintains homeostasis, consistent levels of conditions inside your body. All right, so the thermoregulation, maintaining body temperature, right? If you're hot, you have not only physiological ways to maintain your body temperature, ways your body internally determines what body temperature it's going to be. You can sweat. That's going to help cool you off. You can dump water on your head, which is going to help cool you off. You can, if you're cold, you can crank up your metabolism. It's like turning up the furnace, right? So one thing that occurs when your cells are making energy, when they're burning glucose, when they're burning sugar as a way to keep your cells alive, one of the byproducts of that is heat. So the more of that food that your body breaks down, the more heat you produce. If you're cold, your body's going to start cranking through more calories to crank out more body heat to keep you warm. So that's what happens if you're an endothermic organism, like what you typically historically would be called a warm-blooded organism. If you're cold-blooded or ectothermic, you have behavioral ways to warm yourself up if you're cold. You go lay in the sun. Since things like lizards and snakes and amphibians and those kinds of things don't have the endothermic capability like we do, turning up the furnace in our body, for example, what they're going to do is they're going to go lay in the sun longer, and that's going to heat them up. So we're going to talk about all kinds of homeostatic mechanisms for all kinds of things. We're going to see it in digestive system, we're going to see it in urinary system, we're going to see it in respiratory and circulatory systems. Really important concept. All right, so this one, the words got cut off a little bit, but the key to this is that organisms still grow and change while maintaining homeostasis. So even though we're maintaining these consistent internal conditions, most of the time, in a way, we're still kind of changing at the same time, which is kind of a paradoxical sort of a thing, it's kind of cool, actually. All right, so metabolism. Where do we get our stuff that we need to maintain ourselves and make more of ourselves? Nutrients. This is carbon and nitrogen and those kinds of things, right? They're going to come from air, water, soil, other living things. Depending on what kind of organism you are, it comes from one of those places. Now, if you're an animal, the only way you're going to get your nutrients is by getting them typically, at least in nature, from other living things. If you're a plant, you get your nutrients from the air and from the sun, kind of in combination. We call that photosynthesis, right? So depending on what kind of organism you are, you get nutrients from those kinds of places. The cool thing about nutrients is that they're always cycling. Right? So if one organism dies, the nutrients are broken down, they're recycled back into the ecosystem, and eventually taken up by some other organism. So nutrients, for the most part, don't really go anywhere in the ecosystem. They tend to kind of stay put because when one thing dies, somebody else is going to take up those nutrients pretty quickly. Okay. Energy, on the other hand, is a different story. The ultimate source for all energy, for like 99-point-something% of life on the planet, is the sun. We as humans rely on the sun indirectly to maintain ourselves. So we've got the sun up here radiating energy, which is taken up by producers, right? So we've got something like a milkweed plant here in this picture. These are photosynthetic. They're taking energy from the sun. They're converting it into chemical energy, which can then be passed on to other organisms. We can pass chemical energy on to decomposers. If this plant dies, the decomposer community, in this case the fungi, are going to break that down and release those nutrients, some of which may be taken up again by producers. On the other hand, these producers can also become food for consumers, like this beetle here. This insect is feeding on this consumer biomass to maintain itself. Right? And so in that case, now we've got either the waste from the beetle, the dead leaf, the beetle itself. Those are all going to be passed on eventually also to the decomposer community. But the other really important part of this picture, the one that we can't overlook, is all these wavy red arrows, the heat arrows. Because this is one of those things we talk about with laws of thermodynamics. We're going to see this in chapter 4, just really quickly in this course. Anytime you convert energy from one source to another, sun to plant, plant to beetle, plant to fungus, beetle to fungus, whatever. Anytime you convert energy from one form to another form, you're always going to lose some of the energy as heat. Converting from plant to beetle, you're going to lose, in all likelihood, about at least 65 to 70% of the energy as heat. A huge chunk of the energy transfer is going to go away as heat. So what does that mean about the total amount of energy in an ecosystem? Maybe we've got an ecosystem that consists of a plant and a beetle and a bird that eats the beetle. 3 levels. We'll keep it simple. By the time the bird gets its food, there is not going to be that much energy left in that ecosystem. Because every time you transfer it, you're losing like maybe 3/4 of it to heat. So it really limits the number of levels you can have in a food chain that way. All right, so we talk about ways to get energy. there are two main ways that any organism can get its energy. We have organisms that are photosynthetic, or in other words, another way to say this is they're autotrophic. Autotrophic organisms get their carbon, which is kind of one of the really big central components of their bodies. Autotrophs get their carbon from a non-living source. And not only is it non-living, it never was living. So in part, photosynthetic / autotrophic organisms get their carbon from the sun. They take solar energy, they take carbon dioxide from the air, they take water from the soil, and they use that to make glucose, which is an organic carbon-containing molecule. They're autotrophic. Their carbon is coming from the air, which is a non-living thing. Never was a living thing. Okay? So plants, algae, some bacteria are autotrophic. They're getting their carbon from a non-living source. On the other hand, almost everybody else in the world is what we call a heterotroph. So heterotrophs are going to get their carbon from a living or previously living source. So for heterotrophs, we are looking at things like animals. Right? I could put you in a room filled with CO2 and leave you there all day long. I don't care how much CO2 you breathe. Not good for you. Don't do it. I don't care how much CO2 you breathe. You're not going to make any carbohydrate out of that. You're not going to make any sugar just by breathing CO2. You can't do it. You're an animal. It doesn't work. For you to get your carbohydrate, you have to consume food. You have to consume something that either is a living thing or previously was a living thing, a plant, an animal, something like that, to get your carbon. So animals, fungi, a very, very tiny number of plants, some of the algae, and even some bacteria are heterotrophic. We get our carbon from a living or previously living source. Predators, herbivores, parasites, those kinds of things are heterotrophs. The key to this, the thing we have to remember here is that for all of these organisms, energy is coming from the sun. There's no way around that. Humans, we are sustained by the sun. If the sun were to burn out tomorrow, plants would shut down, they would die. Without plants to feed animals, we'd have no food. So if there are no plants, we can't be herbivorous. We can't be carnivorous because the animals that eat the plants are not going to be around either. So sunlight is really, really critical for sustaining all life on the planet. Directly for the plants, indirectly for the animals and fungi and everybody else. All right, so we're going to stop here, and I'm going to start up the next section of the lecture so this doesn't get to be too long. I'm just going to pause this really quick.